Distinguished delegates, good afternoon. It is an honor to be able to contribute to your discussion here today, and I really would like to extend a warm thank you to Bishop Andre Thomas for the invitation. Now, what I would like to do in this short video presentation is really just address three topics. Now, the first is to give you a sense of what's happened here in terms of Israel's crazy agricultural story right from the beginning through to today. To give a little bit of background on who we are and what has brought us to this conversation. And the third thing is really to share our vision for cooperation. So when I usually start an address of this sort, I like to actually make it a little bit interactive with the audience. And I would often ask for a show of hands. And I know I'm on the video, so it's rather difficult, but I think let's do it anyway. So could I just ask to see a show of hands? Who in the audience today has actually visited Israel before? Now, I can't see how many of you are sitting here now with your hands up, but I'll hazard a guess of 50%. You can put your hand down. Now, I would like to extend a very warm invitation to all of those of you who did not raise your hand and who have not been to Israel to come and visit us over here, perhaps when the corona situation calms down a little. And then I would actually ask all of those of you who did raise your hand, who have visited Israel before, really to back me up when I tell you that despite what you've heard, Israel is not a natural nor sensible place to do agriculture. And it really doesn't make sense that it's emerged as one of these global leaders of agricultural innovation and technologies. Now, to try and prove that, I would actually like to walk you through some of the key challenges that Israel's faced in creating an agricultural sector. Now, I'll show these on the slides if I've shared my screen successfully. What you need to remember is that Israel, first of all, is a very small country. In addition to that, 2/3 of the country are semi-arid or arid. Now, what this means is that Israel really lacks naturally arable soil. Not a great start to do agriculture. Now, the second challenge really relates to water, also to do with the semi-arid environment that we have. Israel contends with a severe shortage in water resources and a scarcity of precipitation. Now, Israel is long and thin, and the 2/3 are desert really in the bottom half. So the precipitation is greater up in the north, but gets less and less the further south you go. Now, the third challenge that Israel's had to contend with in terms of its agricultural production relates to its export markets. Israel's position geographically, I like to say Israel is situated in a rather difficult neighborhood, which means that its export markets historically have been just that further afield, let's say looking to Europe. Now, this obviously poses a great challenge in terms of post-harvest storage and maintaining the quality for exports to ensure that our produce is of good enough quality by the time it reaches these further off export markets. And the fourth challenge, it's hard to imagine today, really relates to food security. Today you come to Israel, and for those of you who haven't been, when you come to Israel, you will really see this abundance of food everywhere. It's really critical to the culture and everything happens around dinner. But in the early days of the state of Israel, specifically with this huge influx of population, national food security had not been secured. So Israel was working to secure national food security at the same time as trying to develop this agricultural economy. Now, the reason I've shared these challenges with you today is just to give you a context through which Israel has had to create this success, to understand that it doesn't really make sense. So if these were the challenges, what does Israel's success today look like if everyone starts talking about that? I'd like to walk you through just some statistics around production and export, just to give you some idea of what Israel has done to date. So in terms of production achievements, here I've put on the screen some statistics around the tons, 262 tons of citrus fruit Israel produces per hectare versus, for example, 211 tons in Europe. You can see here, and I know tomato is also important where you are, the tomato yield 300 tons per hectare versus an average of 50 tons per hectare globally. Now, this is really attributable to the use of sophisticated greenhouse technology. Also, in terms of production achievements, I think it's a fantastic statistic to share. Many countries around the world face great challenge in terms of post-harvest loss of grains. The storage is very difficult. Average worldwide loss of grains is 20%, Very often in developing countries, specifically in Africa, it's much higher, around 40%. And quite remarkably in Israel, we've managed to reduce the post-harvest storage of grain losses down to 0.5%. Really a fantastic achievement. And the last statistic I want to share around production achievements really relates to cow milk productivity. Israel has the most productive milk cow in the world, producing 13,000 litres per cow versus 6,000 litres in Europe. I would also like just to touch on the export achievements that Israel has managed. And while you can see these data points in the middle of the screen, I would really like to remind you that Israel is a small country. And at the bottom here, you can see that Israel only has 295,000 hectares of arable land. And what strikes me, originally coming from London to Israel, and probably some of you that have been to Israel before, is traveling down to the south of Israel, down into the semi-arid, arid desert areas. And instead of looking at the sand, you suddenly see all of this greenery emerging. It's really the vision that our first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, had in making the desert bloom. That is exactly what Israel has managed to do. And it's turned these deserts into great production areas for agriculture. So you see that they are green. You can see some of the statistics here on the screen that over 40% of Israel's vegetables are grown in the desert. And it's not just the vegetables that are growing there, but the desert is also home to the fish farms, to olive groves, to date plantations, to vineyards, to jojoba, which is used for cosmetics. And it's really this combination of R&D, expertise, protocols that's enabled Israel to turn its deserts into productive agricultural lands. And the last point I wanted to touch on regarding some of Israel's achievements really relates to water, because Israel has such a shortage and scarcity of water. Now, I put a statistic here at the top just to compare and give you a source of comparison, that Israel has only 90 cubic meters of internal renewable water per capita annually. And you can compare that to Barbados, for example, which has 281, or Trinidad and Tobago, which is 2,819. Now, what Israel has managed to do is create agriculture, successful agriculture, in the face of this water scarcity. And there are obviously several reasons how it's managed to do that. But one of the key things I want to draw your focus and attention to is what we call water use efficiency. And the slogan I like to use is really more crop per drop. The idea being that you want to use the smallest amount of water possible to get the maximum amount of yield. Now, what you can see here on the screen in this chart, this red line running across reflects agricultural water use, how much water was used. Now, what you can see here is that it has remained relatively constant from 1986 to 2008. Yet at the same time, due to our increased water use efficiency, with the same amount of water, Israel has managed to increase its crop yields by 40%, which is really rather remarkable. The last point I wanted to touch on regarding water is Israel's use of alternative sources of water. Now, this graph here shows the share of effluent water reclaimed for agriculture and irrigation. Now, Israel has become a world leader in this, and you can see from the statistics that Israel is using 86% of its reclaimed water for agriculture and irrigation. And the second runner-up in the world to Israel at the moment is Singapore with approximately 34%, Australia with 18%, and USA with 9%. So what commonly happens here in Israel when we receive delegations from all around the world, they hear these two different stories. On the one hand, you hear about the almost seemingly insurmountable challenges that Israel faced in order to create this agricultural transformation and emerge as a global leader. Yet on the other hand, you see these fantastic achievements. And so they commonly ask, after seeing these two sides, three key questions. The first is basically, how on earth did you do it? It doesn't make any sense. The second is, if you did it, perhaps we can too. And the third question is, are you able to work with us and to partner together to help us replicate some of the agricultural transformation you managed to create in Israel? Now, in response to some of these questions, we recently partnered with the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change and AGRA. the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, to really answer this question: how Israel became a world leader in agriculture and water, and what insights for today's developing countries exist. Now, I can share this report with you if you would like. It was published relatively recently in September 2019, but what I would like to do is actually just draw your attention to some of the key findings. Now, at the top, you can see these underlying elements. What enabled Israel to succeed was several elements that were really unique to the state of Israel. Like every other country, Israel is unique. And arguably, these are not necessarily replicable. However, the 5 elements underneath these so-called replicable elements actually are. And the one that's most important I would like to emphasize today, because it relates to our role as an organization, is the innovation structure and approach. Now, what I mean by this is that one of the reasons Israel was able to overcome so many of its challenges and really emerge as a global leader was its great commitment and investment of financing into a world-class R&D system, finance and commitment to its extension services, who are really transferring that information out of the laboratories and to the farmer, and to very innovative farmers who all are willing to work together in a closed system to really enable us to overcome challenges and utilize potential emerging opportunities. And that brings me to who we are, which I said was going to be the second part of this video presentation. Again, my name is Danielle Abraham, and I'm the Director of Volcani International Partnerships. We are a non-profit organization, an NGO, and we are the non-profit partner to the Volcani Center, which is Israel's national agricultural R&D center. It is an arm of the Israeli government and was established before the State of Israel in 1921. And this R&D center is really been the driving force behind Israeli agricultural innovation today. So our organization, the non-profit partner, our mission is really to share with parties, stakeholders, different nations around the world, the Israeli agricultural experience, the expertise, and the innovations that we have here with other partners, really to aid in any agricultural transformation or development. And that is exactly what I hope we can do here with you today. So the reason I'm actually addressing you today was because we were very honored to receive a request from the Caribbean Israel Leadership Coalition. And I am happy to confirm that there is great consensus and willingness on our side to partner together, really to see how together we can work to advance the food security and agricultural production goals of the Caribbean, together with the Israeli agricultural expertise and innovation. Now, I was asked just to mention 3 specific areas, one being vegetable production, one poultry, and one cattle. What Israel is doing today and what it might have to offer some of the Caribbean states here. And what I would like to do before sharing a few snippets of information is really re-emphasize something I already said, that what Israel has achieved in all of these different areas isn't really magic, but it's really been a result of dedicated professionalism in each field, the intensive and dedicated R&D, the fantastic role of extension, and also the great cooperation between the parties, and really this holistic view that they're able to take. So I'll just go briefly through the vegetables, poultry, and cattle before bringing everything together. So in terms of the vegetable production, I think there are 3 key things to my mind that we should be mentioning. The first is enhanced yields. The second is high export quality. And the third is the technology which enables you to realize both your yield and quality goals. Both from the yield and quality, from the statistics that I've shown earlier, you can see that Israel is really advanced in those terms. And one of the ways that Israel has been able to produce such high quality and quantity of crops, let's take the tomatoes with 300 tons per hectare, is through the use of greenhouse technologies. So in Israel, we have developed and are using very sophisticated greenhouse technologies, which enable us to reach our yield and quality goals. They're dealing with issues like ventilation, with heating, the efficient use of water, climate controlled environments, and things like that. Now, the second subject was poultry. And I can tell you that in Israel specifically, the egg and poultry sector accounts for almost 1/5 of Israel's entire agricultural production. And our poultry farmers, very similar to your poultry farmers, I'm sure, are concerned in achieving the same things: higher yields, enhanced feed conversion, lower rates of sickness, higher quality of the meat, high resistance from environmental factors. And I can share with you that today, in Israel, the marketing weight for a 38-day-old chick is 2.5 kilograms. So 2.5 kilograms for a 38-day-old chick. And I can also share with you that 10 years ago, it was actually 45 days it took to reach the 2.5 kilogram marker. Now, this reduction between 45 days to 38 days is incredibly significant and was really a result of this collaborative R&D extension effort. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention was relating to cattle. As I've already mentioned, that Israel has, the most productive dairy cow in the world, which they're very proud, with 13,000 liters of milk produced annually. And again, I will emphasize that this milk production statistic is not the result of some kind of magic, as they say, but really a result of the dedicated professionalism required in all of the multidisciplinary fields around the cow. So, for example, we're looking at the genetics, we're looking at the nutrition, we're looking at the health, the fertility, the management of the cow, the cooperation between all of the different bodies, and also, of course, the use of the appropriate technology to help us realize the results. I was also asked a specific question about forage, and I can tell you that in Israel, we actually work very differently from the rest of the world in terms of forage. I mean, if you're looking at the US or Brazil or Russia, primarily because we here are very short of water. So our feed is not so full of concentrate. I mean, in most countries around the world, you will find about a 50-50 ratio. And here in Israel, the ratio is really more 70-30. Now, the third part of this video presentation, just before I close up, was really about the concept behind our partnership. You've heard a little bit about the challenges that Israel has faced, some of the ways that the achievements that it has to show overcoming those challenges, and also some of the specific things that we might be able to share going forward. Now, our real vision for the concept behind our partnership is to initiate a few different pilot projects across the Caribbean region together. And through these pilot projects, what we hope to be able to do is to bring across the Israeli experience, the Israeli expertise, and some of Israel's agricultural innovations, technologies, implement some effective tech transfer together with our experts to demonstrate in these pilot projects how we can create together a profitable and sustainable agricultural production. Now, the idea being that after this initial pilot phase, we will then be able to attract some international financing and scale up those projects further. So now in closing, I would just like to say thank you once again for inviting me to contribute to your discussions here today. And I would also just like to reiterate once more that our mission as an organization, as Volcani International Partnerships, is really quite simple. We are simply looking to find a way to work together, to bring you the best of Israel's agricultural experience, expertise, and innovation, to see how together we could realize a stronger agricultural development for the Caribbean. So thank you very much for the invitation to speak. Please take care of yourselves in this Corona era time, and God bless. Thank you very much.